Welcome to St. Thomas More Lynchburg's Homily Podcast. We join Father John Christian as he brings his insight and application to the readings for the 24th Sunday in Ordinary Time.
It's always interesting how Jesus, when he is revealed to be the Christ, always enjoins silence upon those that say it. We've heard this. This is the third week in a row now where we've heard an instance where Jesus says, do not tell anyone about it. The first was silencing the demon that identified him, and then again, not telling the Gentiles not to talk about healing the man who was deaf and mute. And then again, we hear Peter correctly proclaim, you are the Christ. And Jesus once again enigmatically says, do not tell anyone. And it's kind of an interesting thing because it is, again, that messianic secret that we see throughout the Gospel of Mark. And it's something that's very interesting because it highlights the scandal that Jesus is about to kind of show to his disciples, right? The scandal or folly of the cross. For the Christ that Jesus is the one that was expected, but not in the way that was expected. For the anointed one, the Christ, the Messiah, was longed for, hoped for, begged for, and was thought that he would come and save the people of Israel from oppression. However, though, again, human beings, we think as we do, whereas God, everything is infinitely bigger. And so, of course, Christ came to do much more than liberate Israel from Roman occupation or foreign aggression. Rather, he came to liberate all people from the power of the grave. And this he accomplished through the cross. And so when we think about it and we pause, here we have hindsight to see how it all makes sense. But imagine being there in that moment when the one identified as the Christ tells you that he must suffer and die. It is indeed scandalous in the truest sense of the word, scandalon, that Greek word for a stumbling block. It is an impediment to faith, because you hear that and say, well, then how can this be the one who is to come if he's going to suffer and die? And then Jesus has that line about those who wish to come after me need to take up their cross. For one instance, we can be tempted to think of this as an anachronistic statement, for was it not Christ's own passion that gave meaning to the whole phrase of taking up one's cross? But it is indeed a contemporary expression from that time because of the well-known and established Roman oppressive custom of making prisoners or convicts, convicted criminals, carry their cross to their site of execution. And so we have an added layer of scandal. Not only does Jesus say that he's going to suffer and die, he is now implying that he's going to suffer and die like a convicted criminal. And so again, the human minds of the disciples look at this, and especially Peter, and it's astonishing. And Peter goes to him and says, this cannot be. And of course, that famous rebuke where Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan, for you're thinking as human beings do and not as God does. What Jesus highlights for us is that the Christ must come and suffer. God coming to be amongst us is the incarnate Word and has a human body. And so the absolute most essential thing that he can give out of love for us is that very body. Jesus pours out all of his lifeblood on the cross for the simple reason that in his humanity, that is what he has to give. His own essential essence of life, his very lifeblood that pours out in rivulets from the crown of thorns, from the nail wounds, from the pierced side upon that cross. And so Jesus gives us the perspective and context for that suffering because, again, he invites us, or really requires us, calls us to take up our crosses and follow after him because that's what love does. It always seeks to give the maximum, never the minimum. It's not like the calculus that enters into war or games where you want the greatest effect with the least expenditure. Love does the opposite. It gives the maximum because that's, of course, what it does. And so Jesus Christ, that is the necessity behind his suffering. When God came to be amongst us, God made flesh, he gives everything. And so we're all called to then, to a certain extent, embrace the suffering that is a piece of this fallen world. God created the world, it is good, but it is also indeed fallen. Sin and death have entered into the world, and there is inevitable suffering. All of us one day will perish from this earth. That's just going to happen. There's no two ways about it. And so there is a certain concomitant amount of suffering that is in the human life. But our Lord Jesus Christ, again, gives us that grace to put it into its context. For we're not called to avoid suffering and seek only pleasure and amusement, but rather to embrace that which comes our way and to embrace it boldly for that sake of the love of God, and to do it really as an act of faith. For we hear about the importance of faith in that letter of St. James, a letter that very interestingly, during the Protestant Revolution, Martin Luther tried to have removed from the sacred scriptures. But even his heretical accomplices at the time thought that was just a bit too far to start ripping pages out of the Bible because they didn't agree with your formulation. But it's something that we hear often. People will say, oh, one of the distinctions between Catholics and Protestants is Protestants believe in faith alone, and Catholics believe in faith and works, which is, of course, a heresy. We don't believe in that. What we believe is that justification and salvation are all through the grace of God. However, what we do believe is that there is not this kind of one moment where we can stand up in the assembly, proclaim Christ as Lord, and then just be automatically saved from that point on forever. Rather, we view it as an ongoing active decision and cooperation in God's grace. Because we see, as St. James highlights, faith without works is dead. That is to say, it isn't faith. That's not faith. And so there's a distinction to be made between, well, what is this faith placed in? Is our faith in the truthfulness of God, or is our faith in the certainty of our own mind? And that's a very, very significant distinction, because just because I have the conviction of it doesn't necessarily mean that it is. It has to be placed on Jesus Christ and not on my conception of Jesus Christ. In other words, I can't put my faith in my faith. Faith needs to be in God. And then, so if that is the case, we are cooperating in grace. And if we are cooperating in grace, then acts must necessarily accompany. Then taking up our cross and following Jesus makes more sense, because that's what the Christian life is like. That ongoing process. We're all on that road to Calvary. Some are rockier than others, and some crosses are heavier than others, but we're all on that road. Because the Christian life isn't just some one and done instance, like some bitter medicine that can be quaffed down in one gulp. It's something that has to be sipped again and again and again. We can't just write one big check for it, but rather a series of little checks, because it's ongoing. And there is an element of difficulty to that. But again, it makes sense when we put it in the context of our Lord's own passion, of our Lord's own cross. He calls us to take up our crosses and follow after him. And he did that out of love for us, and he did that he might liberate us for all time from the power of sin, death, and the grave. And so then if we follow him, then it follows to reason that we go where he goes. And indeed, that is the point. Our Lord Jesus Christ calls us to eternal union with himself. And so he calls us to the Christian life and all that it entails, to take up our cross, no matter how heavy, and drag it after him. For that is what we do in love, just as he did in love for us, pouring out his very lifeblood upon the cross. We too can show our love for him by embracing the cross and following after him and trusting in him and placing our faith in him.
Thank you for tuning in to the St. Thomas More Lynchburg's Homily Podcast. For the daily reading and to learn more about the community of St. Thomas More, please visit our website at www.stmva.org. If you were blessed by our podcast today, please give it a like, a kind review, and share it with a friend. God bless.